Hello and welcome to our Lunch and Learn series. My name is Gisela Lopez and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. It is a beautiful day here in Albany, New York, and I hope very much that the sun is shining and the birds are singing wherever you are. Let me thank each of you for joining us today in this virtual space and for making time to learn more about research into youth justice issues. I want to give a special shout out to staff at the New York State Office of Probation and Correctional Alternatives who are in attendance here today, and to all of you who work in probation departments across New York State and beyond. Our audience today includes probation staff from 31 counties in New York State and New York City. So you're all in great company. Our gratitude also goes to our partners in New York State, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, as well as the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. It is our absolute pleasure to host Dr. Adam Fine. Like all of you, I'm looking forward very, very much to his presentation. It is wonderful to have you, Adam. Brian, take it away.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Brian Rainey, as Dr. Lopez said, and I am a research fellow at the YJI. The goals of this webinar series are to 1, act as a source for cutting-edge research on juvenile justice issues, 2, to provide this information in an engaging and thought-provoking format, and 3, to bring together scholars and practitioners from various fields to explore these issues. I'm going to forego the housekeeping today because I think we're all ready to hear from an expert in youth probation. Dr. Adam Fine is an assistant professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. He received his doctorate, specializing in developmental psychology and quantitative methods, from the University of California, Irvine, a developmental psychologist conducting research at the intersection of psychology, law, public policy, and criminology. Dr. Fine's research broadly focuses on juvenile delinquency and juvenile justice. His current work centers on 2 areas: how youth develop their perceptions of law enforcement, the law, and the justice system, and how juvenile probation processes affect youth offending, employment, education, and attitudes. He is the PI of the Youth Justice Lab at Arizona State University. So, without further ado, Dr. Adam Fine.
Thank you, Brian. Let me begin sharing my screen. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to everyone else. I'd like to thank Brian, Giza, and the Youth Justice Institute for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to share with you all the research that I've been doing at the intersection of youth and family engagement with probation. So to set the stage, here's the agenda for today. I'm going to start by actually setting the stage. We're going to shift to talking about some research findings when it comes to families and probation processing. We're then going to shift to some more research that's actually ongoing, just a spoiler alert, it's ongoing, with family youth engagement that I've been doing here locally in Arizona with some wonderful partners. And then we'll end with the Q&A sessions in a bit. So let's start with part 1. Let's set the stage. The juvenile justice system was founded in 1899. It was founded because we believed that youth were fundamentally different from adults in ways that required different treatment under the law. It took us a while, but we eventually created juvenile probation. The idea that we should have youth actually serving out their terms and conditions or their sanctions or their requirements, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, you use different language, right? But within the community, at home, within their normalized settings. When we created the juvenile justice system, we created it based off this foundational principle of parens patriae. Now, you're not here for a Latin lesson, I know, but very quickly, right? And I'm not qualified to give you a Latin lesson either, but it's the idea of the state as the parent, the benevolent protector of youth, of wayward youth, of youth and families who require our care. The idea is that it justified the state's intervention in the family. And nowadays, probation tends to try to work very closely with youth and parents, right? In my classes, I always invite juvenile probation officers to come speak to the students. And in one of the most recent ones, an officer said to the students, PO doesn't stand for probation officer. It stands for a parent officer. We stand in as parents. We help the youth. We operate in many ways that parents actually do. At the same time, we help the parents. So PO isn't a probation officer, it's a parent officer. And the reality is that when youth are placed on probation today, they are under the dual jurisdiction of the state, of the probation officer, as well as the family. Family is vitally important. But the question is, how well are we actually engaging families? And Brian, this would be a good time to bring up the poll, please. I want to ask you all this question. How much do you feel like your juvenile justice system is engaging youth and families? How much do you feel like your juvenile justice system is engaging youth and families? I think this is a vital question, and I think it's going to set the stage for the rest of our talk today, our lunchtime chat for many of you, or our breakfast time chat for others. Brian, it looks like we've got a good number of responses at this point. It's definitely a representative sample. So here's the results. 56% of you said somewhat. 17% of you said very little. 2% of you said not at all. Now, I don't know how many of you are coming from each individual jurisdiction, but I think this is really important for us to know. When we asked, you all are saying not at all, very little, largest proportion of you are saying somewhat, and then about 24% of you are saying to a great extent. I think that's really important for us to begin with. Okay, I think that poll is gone away. Thank you all for participating, I appreciate it. Well, we think it's really important, right? The Casey Foundation recently put out a framework for engaging families, and they said, and I quote, ongoing effective family engagement is critical to achieving positive youth outcomes, but most systems fall short of building meaningful partnerships with families. The Campaign for Youth Justice is saying, we know that the ability of family members to meaningfully participate in their children's lives makes a dramatic difference on youth outcomes. We know it's important, but most of us believe we are either falling short or we have a ways to go to improve family engagement. Well, what is family engagement? To me, it begins with this fundamental belief that actually all families do care for their children. That all families, regardless of their trials and tribulations, their struggles, they have some strengths that can be built upon, they can be engaged, and they can be empowered. It's not about a single policy, a single program, a single practice. It's not a single thing. It's the entire culture of the organization. How much are we actually partnering with youth and their families? The evidence should be seen in how families feel that they are treated, how much they feel like they are a partner at a systemic level. I'm not just talking about an individual officer. How much do you feel as though at a systemic level, the system is really trying to help you and engage you and partner with you? Vital here is voice and opportunity. Youth and families must have voice. They must feel as though their input, their culture, their context, their personal experiences are all valued. So that raises my second polling question today. How much do you think youth and families think your juvenile justice system is engaging them? The key distinction here is it's not you. What do you think youth and families think? How do they feel? It's a very different question if you take a step back and think about it, which I hope you're doing right now. And based off of the percentage of you who have already voted, you've already thought about it. I'm gonna wait a couple more seconds. You all vote pretty quickly, I'm noticing. How much do you think youth and families think your juvenile justice system is engaging them? Great, Brian, I think that's probably enough. 65% of you said very little. 4% not at all. 31% somewhat. 0% of people said to a great extent. Now let's take a step back. We created the juvenile justice system because we believe that youth are fundamentally different from adults, that requires different treatment under the law. We are based in this foundational principle of parens patriae, the father of the country, right? That benevolent protector that's supposed to be engaging youth and families. I think this poll is really telling. There were 25% of you that said to a great extent that you think that you're engaging youth and families. But now we have 0% saying that from the youth and families' perspectives. That is vital to me, right? When the Casey Foundation came out with their family engagement framework earlier this year, they created this fantastic sort of overall guide to transforming a juvenile justice system that wants to focus on family engagement. And you can look at this report online. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because this is a lot of text. I just highlighted a few things, and I'm just going to focus on a few, right? When it comes to creating a staff culture centered on families, you got to focus on families' needs and strengths. We have to develop a network of support services and resources to address family needs throughout the process. Systems have to engage families. They need to create an environment in which families are empowered to have voice. Families must actively participate in all decisions. But I'm going to make this go away because I know when you put a lot of text, people read all the text. Each one of these actually requires that the system knows on a case level how much the youth and the families actually feel as though they are engaged. Now, the Casey Foundation came out with this fantastic tools for systems, jurisdictions to self-assess. How much do you feel as though you are engaging families, things like that. But is that the whole story? When you ask someone to self-assess, does that tell you everything? I will tell you, no, from personal experience with my teaching evaluations. If you ask me if my students are learning, I'll tell you absolutely, right? But you ask the students and you might find a slightly different story. So the question is, how do you really know if youth and families actually have a voice? And what we've seen from these two polling questions before is what we think we know might not be all there actually is to know. So let's shift to part two. Let's see what the impact is of perceptions of the family on actual case outcomes. We'll start with a probation processing study. So let's say you've got a 15-year-old. He's been arrested for vandalizing a wall, low-level crime, right, in most jurisdictions. And it's his very first time. Well, what happens to this 15-year-old arrested for vandalism for the very first time? Well, he's arrested, the officer decides to actually put that case forward. Well, what can happen to the kid after typically he meets with an intake officer, as you all probably, or most of you who work in juvenile justice systems, right, would know, is that the intake officer will interview the kid and the family, and then they will recommend an outcome. Either they recommend that the case moves deeper into the system, recommend formal processing so the kid actually goes through the juvenile court process. There's also a chance that he'll be diverted from the juvenile court process and instead placed on something like probation or supervisory conditions in the community. Or he might just receive some sanctions and be dismissed. Now, there's actually a whole host of different offenses that we call 50-50 crimes. If you take a look historically at the data, when you look at these particular offenses, there's a 50% shot that that kid is going to be processed formally or informally. So what happens? What's affecting these processing decisions? Well, we know there's the legal factors, right? Kids who have a richer offending history or more serious offense are more likely to be processed formally. We know that. There's also extra legal factors. There's a host of studies out there that tell us that individual characteristics like age, race, SES, remorse, attitude, those things also can affect the way the kid is processed. Now, our question in this study was, once you account for all those things, how much does the home environment, perceptions of the home environment, impact the way the kid is processed? Vital here is when that kid is being processed, the parent or guardian is in there with them. They're sharing information with that intake officer, that probation officer, right? So how much does that information that they share about the family impact that processing decision above and beyond all of these other things, these legal factors and other extra legal factors, right? This particular study came from the overall Crossroads study. Crossroads is led by Beth Kaufman, Paul Frick, and Lauren Steinberg, three fantastic researchers who I've had the pleasure of working with for, at this point, I think 8 or 9 years. It's funded generously by the MacArthur Foundation, OJJDP, the County of Orange, and the William T. Grant Foundation. Vitally, This study received a privacy certificate from the Department of Justice. What that does is it actually protects the kids' responses from subpoena, from involuntary disclosure. So when we ask kids about everything, from their offending, previous offending, current offending, to their sexual history, these kids tell us the truth. And they tell us some pretty graphic things because they know, and we explain it to them multiple times throughout our interviews that we do with them every 6 months, that, hey, anything you say to us is actually just staying here with us. It's not reported back to your probation officer. The idea is that we can then get at the dark figure of crime, right? How much crime is there actually happening versus how much crime, right, is being found out. For this study, we actually used just a small subsample of the Crossroads Study, 329 first-timers, males 13 to 17 from one site in California, and we interviewed them twice, after their arrest and then 6 months later, right, when they've been on probation for a while. Predominantly Latino sample, consistent with the demographic makeup of the site from which we drew the sample. So, as I mentioned before, you've seen this slide. By study design, we constrained the legal factors. These are all first-timers for very low-level types of offenses. We then accounted for all of these covariates, these extra legal factors, predominantly by using advanced statistics, so we can actually compare apples to apples here. And that enables us to isolate the effects of the home environment. Now, how did we do that? Well, we actually looked at the official record documents from the probation department, right? So that probation department uses this overall checklist. What do you think of the home environment after you meet with the youth and the family? Major problem, minor problem, no problem. Checkbox. We then also looked at their things, other things on that form too, like what do the parents or guardians think about the kids' friends, right? If the probation officer's in the room, friends probably really matter too, right? So above and beyond those effects of friends, we looked at the effects of the home environment as well. So, to what extent does home environment actually affect the processing decision? Once we take into account all of these other factors, age, race, SES, remorse, offense characteristics, zero offending history, perceptions of the peers, we found that it predicted more intensive processing at every stage. More likely to be diverted than sanction and dismiss. More likely to be formal than diverted, and more likely to be formal than sanction and dismiss. In fact, if you take a look at the effect sizes, nobody wants a statistics lesson, but we'll do this really quickly. Kids were 17 times more likely to be recommended to formal than they were sanction and dismiss if the PO said, hey, I think this is a problematic home environment. 17 times more likely. So let me summarize that. Above and beyond these legal and these individual characteristics, youth receive more intensive probation processing dispositions to recommendations from the intake officer if the probation officer believes that the home environment is problematic. Now, the natural question that many of you probably have is what exactly are these POs picking up on? So, as I want to remind you really briefly, we have this privacy certificate from the Department of Justice. So we ask these kids all of these things about their life, their family history, what's going on at home. And they tell us the truth because we have a privacy certificate. We can't share this with anybody unless they're hurting themselves, they're hurting others, and there's a couple other conditions, right? So let me ask you all, what do you think the probation officers were picking up on when they decided that the home environment is a problem? Which of these do you believe? Brian, now is a great time. Is it rule setting, curfew setting, parental monitoring effort, parental monitoring knowledge? You can pick as many as you believe. And the reason why I separate monitoring effort and knowledge is because, as many parents here probably know, there's probably a big difference between how much you try to know, you might try a lot, versus how much you really know, right? I can attest, I don't have my own kids, but I can attest from my adolescent period too, right? So which of these do you think the probation officers were picking up on? And you can select all that apply. I believe that should be possible. Rule setting and enforcement, curfew setting, parental monitoring effort, parental monitoring knowledge. This is the youth's perceptions of what's going on in the home, right? Maybe 3 more seconds. All right, Brian, can we share those results, please? You're so much faster than me. So most of you said rule setting, 80%, about 60% said curfew setting, about 70% parental monitoring effort, about 50% knowledge. All right, That's fantastic, right? So the highest one was rule setting, second highest was monitoring effort. How much are they trying? Turns out, none of them. The answer is none of them. When we look at this statistically, we could not find that any of these predicted the likelihood of the youth's home environment being rated as problematic. What you think you know might not be what's actually happening, right? Insofar as you believe these kids are actually telling us the truth, which I happen to fundamentally believe because of having sat in on hundreds of these interviews over time. And here's what's really problematic too, and I want to draw attention to this. We followed these kids for 6 months while they were on probation. So we got to look within kid, how is your rule setting in the home, your curfew setting in the home, your parents' monitoring effort and their knowledge changing when you're placed on probation? It turns out virtually all of these decline when kids are placed on probation. Virtually all of these parental practices decline when kids are placed on probation. And really problematically is we know there's variation. We assessed how much variation there is and how restrictive their supervisory conditions actually were. And that wasn't connected to that rate of decline. What that means is all of these are declining for kids who were placed on probation, and regardless of how restrictive their actual probation supervisory conditions were. Now, we did this in California in one site, but we actually could replicate this in our other 2 sites too, Pennsylvania and also Louisiana. So this is an issue, right? So when it comes to this question that we posed at the beginning, right? This is the title of my talk. Is it dual or dueling supervision? My conversations with probation officers about these data and about their lived experiences says that it actually tends to seem to be more dueling than dual. In many cases, the parents say, he's your problem now. They're so exasperated, they're so tired. That seems to be what's happening. So now let's shift to part 3, about family youth engagement and the projects that I'm working on here locally in Arizona with some wonderful partners I'll mention in a second. You've seen this slide before. This is the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Family Engagement Framework, right? All of these are fantastic ideas for how we can improve family engagement, how to create a cultural change or shift if it's necessary, right, towards engaging families. I actually don't think it's necessary at all. Most jurisdictions that I've worked with want to engage families better. They're just looking for partners. And I'm more than happy and love working with partners on how we can do this, right? Each one of these requires that we actually know what is happening though, right? There's a wonderful tool for self-assessing how much is your department or your jurisdiction really doing this. But do we really know until we've actually assessed youth and families' perspectives? Do we really know until we've heard their voice? So for this project, this is taking place currently only in Arizona, but we are very much looking to expand now that we've been doing it for some time. It started with the Maricopa County Juvenile Probation Department, and here I have to thank Chief Mo, Elizabeth Els, and Alex for all of the hard work that they're doing, as well as my interns who are actually doing all of these interviews, these surveys with youth and families. We've also expanded to Pinal County. I have to thank the director, Michelle Lund, Denise Smith, Corey Jacobs, Brooke O'Brien, as well as my interns there who are doing fantastic work to make this happen, as well as my youth justice lab team who are sort of my data monkeys helping me actually code the data, clean the data, analyze the data. There's a ton of data that's coming in here, and they have been integral with helping me actually organize this study and make it happen. So I want to thank my partners here from Maricopa, Pinal, and my Youth Justice Lab. So here's where we're at with this process. Over about a year to a year and a half, we focused on building trust. I was brand new to Arizona. Nobody knew me. I didn't know anybody. I didn't even know, right, really how the systems work. Those of you who work in juvenile justice know every system is slightly different, right? Every jurisdiction is slightly different. And I'm brand new. So over a year and a half, we're building trust. So they know that I'm not just one of those researchers who comes in, I want your data, I analyze the data and I never come back, right? That's not who I am, that's not my approach, but they don't know that, right? So we had to work together for a long time to build this trust. We also spent a year and a half designing the surveys and the study itself. That's a year and a half of working closely to get to a place where we are all very happy with the specific items that we are asking, the way that we're implementing this, and what we're doing together. Then we had to get the official approval. So now we have, the groove set with the IRB stuff, with the MOUs and the AOs from the courts. And it took us some time, but we are there, we are launched, and we are rolling. Then came the actual surveying. So we survey the youth and the families when they're placed on probation, and then multiple times throughout the probationary process, so that we can look within person, eventually look within person to see how perceptions are actually changing. Obviously, we need to create some interim reports as well. So once we have enough data from the surveys, we create interim reports to see how things are going, how these snapshots look, and then that should feed back into the survey too. If there are things that are, we're a 5 out of 5 on certain things, well, maybe we should change the survey to assess other things, other areas that we actually might want to focus on and improve. And then the long term is to focus on implementing changes to probation. So the survey should feed into the interim reports, which should feed into implementing changes, which should feed back to the reports, which should feed back to the survey. It's a closed sort of loop here, right? It's an iterative process. We're not doing an RCT, randomized controlled trial right now. We're trying to see the effects of intervention. No, we're trying to get an idea of what's happening, right? So it's an iterative process where we're working together over time to survey, report, implement changes, and then the cycle continues. Now, I gave you the spoiler alert at the top. We're really right here. We are maybe a little bit on the right side because we're preparing the reports right now, but we're actively collecting data, and our first reports to each county are going to come out at the end of this month. We actually are in the process of scheduling those dates right now. So again, this is 2 counties in Maricopa and Pinal County. Collectively, it's over 60%, almost 70% of youth, depending on which numbers you're looking at, but about 70% of youth and families on probation in the state. We assess both the youth and the parent because it's important to triangulate, right, perceptions and ensure that everyone has voice. It's electronic, it's audio assisted, we've translated it and back translated it into Spanish. And the reason why we do it electronic and audio assisted is because we do know that the reading level for youth who are on probation tends to be lower than youth in the community. And we want to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to have their voice heard. And we've created this robust internship program, and our interns are the ones who actually do all of the calls with the youth and the families currently. So I told you we've spent quite a bit of time developing the survey, and here are some of the overall areas. We've got barriers to the relationships. I used to live way south in Southern California, and my partner, now fiance, she used to live up in LA. Now it took me about 2 hours to drive up to her. And I used to tell her that's a barrier to our relationship, right? Same thing here. How much are kids and families able to actually drive to probation appointments? Is transportation a barrier? Is tech a barrier? Language, right? Beyond that, we're assessing their general knowledge. How much do you understand your requirements? We're assessing self-efficacy. How much do you feel responsible for your own success? And as a parent, how much do you feel responsible for your kid's success, right? The idea there is to look at that shift and how much is it focused on he's your problem now, or he's both of our, right? We're working on this together. We assess, obviously, experiences with the probation officer, family engagement, services, programming, and so on. This is a really exciting survey. We're actively collecting the data, and the idea here is to give youth and family voice, and not just in a snapshot, over time. We want to ensure that we're maintaining our ability to get youth voice over time. And I realize I'm going a little bit over my time. So let me end with this. Families are viewed almost universally as vitally important for youth success on probation or justice-involved youth in general. We know from the studies I've shown you today, and I'm sure you all know from your individual jurisdictions, that perceptions of the family do impact how the system treats the youth, and rightfully so, right? This is why we have a juvenile justice system founded under this idea of parens patri, right? The benevolent protector. But when it comes to family engagement, I don't think we're there yet. Justice for Families has a wonderful guide. Casey Foundation is creating some wonderful guides and frameworks right now. But I don't think we're really there yet. We're really just beginning to scratch the surface. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to Brian's questions and to questions from the audience as well. Brian, I apologize, I went a minute over.
No, you're totally fine. Thank you for all of that, Adam. So now we're going to move into sort of an informal conversation portion between Adam and I. So you just presented a lot of great, really interesting research. But I was wondering, where should future research in this area really be focusing its attention so we can learn more about this process?
It's a great question, Brian. So I think just to echo what I started to say before, we're just starting to scratch the surface here. There are not many systematic studies of multiple jurisdictions, let alone anything longitudinal, assessing youth and families' perceptions and relationships with probation. So to me, future research needs to expand what we're doing here currently. I also think that we need to start thinking about perceptions of probation, expectations for their relationships with probation officers. We should be including this within this risk, need, responsivity framework that jurisdictions are starting to implement. I think it's really important for us to assess, what do you expect from your relationship with your PO before you start to build your relationship with your PO? That to me is fodder for a healthy, collaborative relationship moving forward. I think many times we just get into that interview, we just get into, all right, here are your terms and conditions, and we don't necessarily set the stage. And I know probation officers are extremely busy, and this could be really daunting, but I think it's a really vital part of it, right? It's setting the grounds for what I perceive to be a relationship and a partnership moving forward.
So what do you think is the most important takeaway from your presentation for juvenile probation officers?
Oh, great question. I think for probation officers, there are some tough takeaways here, right? It's challenging them to think about their relationships with youth and families as relationships, as us working together on the youth outcomes. I think the big takeaway here is actually more for supervisors and for chiefs to think differently about, how do we allocate caseloads? What incentives and structures do we put in place for POs to develop healthy relationships with the youth and the families? So I think for POs, it's recognizing, hey, this is really important, but you already recognize that, right? But how do we create it more how do we transform it from dueling to dual supervision? Well, it begins with family engagement, with hearing youth voice. So to me, it's creating incentives and structures for us to ensure that probation officers are set up to succeed here and are encouraged to build these relationships and are able to do it within the confines of their particular jurisdiction structures, as well as putting into place something like this type of study where we're assessing youth and family voice routinely over time. So you can see what the impacts are, right? What the beneficial, positive impacts are of you starting to sort of redesign, rejigger, rework, right? The way that we approach family engagement.
Do you think that there are any other policy or practice implications to your findings that you've already found, and the work that you're planning to do in the future with this project?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to family engagement, we really are just beginning to scratch the surface. I think policy and practice should not be made based off of anecdotes and personal opinions. And I think the reality is, in most cases, that's what happens, right? Either because we don't have the time or we're so excited about some sort of new initiative, we don't necessarily build in the research support structures. And I think we don't want policy and practice to be based off of anecdotes and personal opinions. So what we're doing with the folks in Maricopa and Pinal, to me, is fantastic, because we are trying to assess where and what specifically the problem is. What is it that youth and families actually need? What are we doing well? Where are places that we can grow before we then start implementing, right, different programs, different interventions, different tools, before we start to do that heavy lifting? And I think that's really hard, right, for jurisdictions, because you want to have the impact immediately. And I think that's great. It just needs to also have this sort of research component, so you really are assessing, right, what issues are going on, what are we doing well, what can we build on?
And I don't want to sound negative here, but what do you think are some limitations to your study, and how can we improve upon those limitations?
I don't have all the answers, and I'm happy to be self-critical. I think I've had the pleasure so far of working with 2 jurisdictions that fundamentally believe that we need to enhance family youth engagement with probation. They reach out to me, actually, which is fantastic, right? When we started to build this relationship together. But it's really just 2 jurisdictions. Yes, 60 to 70% of youth on probation in the state so far, but it's 2 jurisdictions. Every jurisdiction is different. These studies are inherently limited because it's only 2 jurisdictions. We want the results to be more generalizable. Folks are here today because they likely want the answers, and I'm giving you the best responses that I can, but even once we have all of the data from these studies, they're going to be limited because they're just a handful of jurisdictions. So I think what we're hoping to do, I'm not sure if this is going to be your next question, but we're hoping to actually expand this research to add more jurisdictions so our results can be more generalizable from a scientific perspective. But from a real practical perspective, we want to make sure that youth and family voices are being heard across jurisdictions and across the country.
So relatedly, if you could have the perfect data set for this work, what would that data set look like? I'm assuming that more people, better, but what information would you like to have?
So part of that is, I would definitely expand this massively, right? We have the structures in place to expand strategically and carefully so that we can bring in more youth and family voice. But there's really 2 things here. One is, as we're moving from this digital world, right, back to in-person things, actually, when we first started this designing the study, the plan was for us to have our interns be in person at the courthouse, right, at the juvenile justice systems with a tablet so they can capture youth and families. It is a reality that many youth and families don't have working phones. So our participation rates are going to be lower among the ones whose phones are turned off and turned on. If we can get people, right, our interns in person to be there, we would be able to get more generalizable data even within our particular jurisdictions and ensure that more youth and family voices can be heard. So I would expand it massively. I would have people, right, being in person. And I think the question is moving forward is, how do we make sure that our questions are both evergreen and fresh at the same time? As jurisdictions implement different tools, they implement different programs, we want to make sure that our questions are reflecting the changes and the unique sort of idiosyncrasies of each jurisdiction, right? The opportunities, the programs, processes that they have within each jurisdiction. So it's a process, right, of building out our questionnaires, our surveys, these interview guides, so we can ensure that the data that we're collecting from each jurisdiction fits that jurisdiction.
Thank you. It looks like a lot of folks in the audience have questions for you. So I'm going to shift to the audience Q&A portion for today. So the first question, have you seen any connections between other systems such as education, mental health, positive youth development, etc., that help support probation and youth or family engagement?
Yes. So at the risk of sounding a little bit like a broken record, I'm not sure who asked this question, but you probably know as well as I do, right, that it's very jurisdiction specific. So certain jurisdictions have the tools or processes or experience or just the opportunities within the community to be connecting with these external entities. These programs that, or these jurisdictions that I work with are starting to implement something called the ThriveCast program. You can read more about this on actually my website. I'm working with professors at ASU in the School for the Future of Innovation of Society. I think that's what it's called. But they are innovation professors who have built this connected growth platform. Essentially what it boils down to is all of the youth, right, receive these tablets while they're in detention, and the youth self-select into modules and areas of their life that they want to grow in. It's from the basics as simple as hygiene all the way through anger management, substance abuse, therapy, positive youth development, building healthy relationships, and so on. And we're in the process of rolling that out in 2 jurisdictions in Arizona right now, and including a pretty robust evaluation protocol as well. This is a positive youth development approach. It's trying to encourage the youth to take ownership, right, of what it is that they want to grow in. It's encouraging them to do that, it's incentivizing it, and then it's also connected, right? So you get to share your success with other people, and they get to, right, sort of like it, right? Give you that positive feedback so you continue along that growth, you continue along your journey. So that's one instance of, hey, we're trying something new here. It's a fundamentally different approach rather than have sort of like ad hoc programming that goes on. No, instead, let's have this tablet-based system, this connected growth platform where you are trying to grow in ways that you find meaningful. That's one really promising positive youth development approach that I've seen recently.
Very cool. So what do you recommend when the family doesn't want to partake in engagement or doesn't believe in the juvenile justice or probation system?
I love that question. I think that goes back to what we started to discuss earlier, you and I, Brian, right? We are getting better at risk needs responsivity. But for some reason, we don't assess youth and families' perceptions of probation as part of that. We don't assess what they expect from the relationship. And I think youth and families don't want to engage with probation if they've already been on probation and that relationship is broken or there's mistrust there, right? We need to set the stage up front before the probation begins in order for you to have a trusting, collaborative partnership, right? Because it's a lot easier for parents to decide he's your problem and to disengage and to say, no, go talk to your PO, or he won't come out of his room. I'm going to call your PO on you, right? I'm sure many probation officers on this call have stories like that, right? Where you've been called in to deal with something that should just be a parenting issue. I think part of that comes from a failure, a broken line of communication, something that's not right in that relationship. Now, I'm not a relationship therapist, right? So maybe we need marriage and family therapists to come in and help probation officers develop these relationships. But I think that something was broken there, and we need a sort of a reset. We need a coming together moment to ensure that everyone knows we're all on the same page here. I'm not out to, as the POs that I work with say, nail them and jail them. I'm actually here more as a social worker. I'm putting on my social worker hat to help you and the family encourage you.
What is your sense of the impact of immigration status on the willingness of families to engage with probation? And how does this impact compliance outcomes for youth?
It's a great question. So from the empirical standpoint, I don't know of any studies that have actually done that on a systematic level. I don't know of any. But my hunch is that I'm a procedural justice researcher as well. So I study the process. I study youth and families' relationships with authority figures, right? I study a lot kids' perceptions of police. And we know, right, that among many immigrant communities, especially among like first generation undocumented or second generation families, that there is mistrust with law enforcement, probation being one face of law enforcement, right? Especially when you're worried about your documentation status. So I have to imagine, right, that as the questioner probably was alluding to, that would impact their willingness to engage with probation. But I think that could be remedied, right? Both on a policy level and on an individual level with those relationships.
Do you see your survey being adaptable to address other points in the juvenile justice system?
Yes, I absolutely do. So with one of the jurisdictions, and I have not specifically asked about this, so I'm not going to name which one because I want to make sure I have clearance to say the things right that I'm saying. But with one of the jurisdictions, they are starting to implement a detention youth survey routinely. And in our most recent discussion, and this is now in the hands of my IRB, but our plan is actually to survey youth when they enter detention and then when they finally leave detention. And when they leave detention, we are going to survey the parent or guardian of the youth as well when they're there to pick up the kid. So the idea there is to look at, okay, what was family engagement and access perceptions like during detention too, right? Probation might be the most common disposition that we provide kids, right? Community supervision, depending on what you call it in your jurisdiction. But there's also a host of kids who are still in detention despite our decarceration movement. So we do have a detention survey that we are starting to implement with youth and families.
Very cool. So as your research findings develop, how can other probation departments or non-researchers learn more about them?
Sure. I'm an open book. You are welcome to, if you didn't get my contact information, I think it's on the materials, or just Google me. Feel free to send me an email. Happy to set up a meeting. And as the reports come out with the jurisdictions, we'll see what we're able to share outside of the specific jurisdictions. Part of that is when we build these relationships, we know these relationships are built on trust, just like it is with a probation officer and a family. So these jurisdictions know I'm not out there to do a gotcha, right? I'm not out there to publish negative findings about your jurisdiction and sort of call you out, right? So we're working together to figure out, okay, what are the areas for growth and improvement, if there are any, right? And then to implement our changes there locally. So part of that is, clearing it with the individual jurisdictions to ensure that I can talk publicly about our results and our findings. But you are more than welcome to email me. I'm happy to set up meetings and chats. And we are beginning to start to look for funding for this, right? 2 jurisdictions, we've got literally hundreds of phone calls that we're making each month to collect these basically youth and family voices, right? So we're starting to think about strategically expanding, to look for funding. So far, we've been doing it with no funding, and I think we're almost near our limit right now. So you're welcome to. I would love to speak with folks. I just saw a note from Giza as well, Brian, about the IRB process.
Yeah. So could you talk about the IRB process? What IRB stands for as well. We love acronyms, but an explanation of that for those in the audience who may not be familiar with research practitioner relationships.
Absolutely. So psychology, I'm a developmental psychologist by training. Psychologists have had a history of doing some not so great studies on some not so willing participants. We'll leave it there. So institutional review boards, or IRBs, are pretty prevalent around the nation. IRBs are institutional review boards that review what it is you want to study as a researcher. So it's internal to the university to ensure that what you're doing is ethical, that it's okay, and that it's, in many cases, they're also checking to ensure that, what you have on your consent form matches what the study looks like, and so on. So we go through an institutional review board process at ASU that's really wonderful. It takes us about 3 to 4 days tops to get approval, which is fantastic. Some universities, it's 6 months to 12 months, so it takes a long time, right, to get studies. Brian, I saw your reaction, so I think you're familiar with some universities it takes a long time. Ours is 3 to 4 days. So that's on our end, right? That ensures that we are doing an ethical study, right? All the approvals, consents, everything's in place. They have all of our documentation and so on. They also ensure that our protocols are updated, that we are receiving the training that we need as researchers to adhere to the most up-to-date standards and so on. On the practitioner side, oftentimes there's a couple administrative things that we have to do too. I like to get 2 things. One is an administrative order. So if I'm working with the juvenile justice system, we like to get an administrative order from the court, even if it's not required, so that judges will actually review what the study is, what our partnership is going to look like, what the system is getting out of it, and they'll sign off on it. In addition, we use our standard MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. So the Memorandum of Understanding basically just outlines the terms of our relationship, right? It's boilerplate language that says, right, X, Y, and Z. Someone from the university signs it, someone from the jurisdiction signs it. It sounds like a lot of paperwork, but it's really not, right? Once you have the paperwork, you have it all written down, which we do now, the AO and the MOU are very straightforward, and the IRB is extremely straightforward because we've already sort of laid that groundwork. We have that path to follow.
Thank you for that. It's nice to hear that the IRB process is relatively easy where you are, because that's not the case everywhere.
I recognize that I'm spoiled. I definitely recognize that.
So another question that an audience member had is, how should we, and this is probation officers, how should we balance not wanting to over-involve ourselves as probation in the family environment?
I love that question. And I think it depends on what your definition is of over-involve. I think if you ask your colleagues, I'm assuming a probation officer asked this, right? But I think if you ask your colleagues where the boundary is, where the line is, I think you'd be pretty shocked by the amount of variability there, right? Where other people will find the line is with being involved. And I think it also depends very much on the family. What is it that the family is asking you to do? What is it that that family needs? Part of that is ensuring that you have a tool, a mechanism to hear from the youth and the families about what it is that they need from you, right? And then you determine where that line actually is. Your system should determine where that line is. I'm not in the practice, right, of telling you what you should do, right? That's not my place. I know what I know and I know what I don't know, right? But I think that line varies based off the individual officer, but it should be sort of a system-wide decision of this is what the chief or whoever's the chief decision maker is, if this is where the line should be. Very briefly, we did a really interesting study where we looked at kids' overall expectations for probation and then their lived reality of probation. So we looked at how much did you expect your PO to act more like law enforcement or more like a social worker? And then we looked at, well, how did your PO actually act? Was it more like a law enforcement officer or was it more like social work? And I did this with Sarah Vidal at Georgetown University and Erica Fountain, who also was at Georgetown University. And the data were collected from 2 jurisdictions in the Northeast. We then looked at that congruence there of what you expect and what your reality is and how it's related to youth outcomes, including their technical violations. How much are you violating the terms of your probation agreement, right? Your terms and conditions. And we found a really fascinating set of results. What it boiled down to is it's actually kind of okay. We tend to say that it's not okay for probation to be very social work. We tend to also say it's not okay for probation to be very law enforcement-y, right? Laying down the law. But it actually is okay to be on those tail ends if that's what the youth was expecting. If that's what the youth was expecting from your relationship, because it's what the youth is telling you they actually want, right? No, I need more of like a guardian who's sort of intense, right? Laying down the law a little bit, keeping me in line. Or no, I need someone who's more softer, right? More relationship focused, more trying to understand my problems, right? It's okay to be on either end of the spectrum if that's what the kid is actually expecting. It's when there's not congruence, right? When your expectations and your reality don't align, that the kids actually violate their probation far more. When they're expecting you to be social worky and you're more law enforcement-y, they tend to violate probation far more frequently. The same goes too when they're expecting you to be law enforcement-y and you're social worky. I'm not sure if I said that one already, but you get the idea.
So could you speak to the outcomes for youth on probation where parents are actively engaged? What are some of the outcomes for these youth?
Is the question, sorry, could you repeat that, Brian?
Yeah, so could you speak to the outcomes for youth on probation where the parents are actively engaged? Do they fare better? Just what are some different outcomes?
So regardless of if we're talking, thank you for clarifying, regardless of if we're talking about within the juvenile justice sphere or the education sphere or the positive youth development sphere, we know that more positive family engagement, more positive parenting is related to better youth outcomes. So that doesn't just mean being super soft and warm and loving. It also means, yes, being warm and loving and supportive is vitally important, as is setting boundaries for your youth, right? There is about 50, 60 years of research within the parenting literature looking at the most effective parenting strategies. And it's not being super authoritarian. It's not being super lenient. It's sort of a mix of both, right? It's being authoritative, which is setting rules and restrictions for your youth. It's checking in on them. It's ensuring that they know what the guidelines and the boundaries actually are. At the same time as relying on your warmth, the positive parts of your relationship that support the youth, knowing that they can come to you with problems, that they can talk to you, that they feel like they're a partner here, right? It's both of those combined that's really important. The same goes for youth on probation, right? parents must have both that positive, warm relationship to rely on, as well as that, hey, I'm going to lay down the law, right? I'm going to have rules for you. I'm going to ensure that you are, abiding by your curfew and the rules that I have within the house within reason. So it's the same in probation as it is with general parenting in the community, schools, and so on.
Thank you for that qualifier, positive engagement, not just engagement at large. Yeah. So one last question. Can you talk about the buy-in work that the Arizona counties used to build internal support for more engagement, and in particular with this type of research partnership?
Absolutely. So I've been fortunate to, when I moved to Arizona about 3 years ago, I didn't know anyone here, right? I was very thankful, right, to join the department of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. I didn't know anyone in the community, right? I was connected with folks over at probation. I wasn't sure what to expect. All I knew was Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and that's about it. And I was blown away in my first meetings with the probation departments, with both Maricopa and Pinal County. So Maricopa welcomed me warmly. We started working together really closely from the beginning. There was very little, attempting to get buy-in. I think there's sort of this misconception. I'm speaking to an audience that already knows this, right? But there's a misconception that like probation departments don't want to work with researchers. No, they don't want to work with researchers who are going to come in, use your data, and leave, right? But that's a terrible relationship. Why I wouldn't want to work with them either. But here I've had there is no buy-in, right? Everyone is fully engaged in how do we promote positive youth development. Now I don't know if every single probation officer feels that way, but the dozen or so probation officers that I now know personally absolutely are, right? The buy-in was there already. They were just looking, to take the next step. Now with Pinal, it was a totally different story. No, I'm just kidding. With Pinal, they heard what we were working on together in Maricopa, and they said, hey, can we set up a meeting to talk about what you're doing and see if maybe there's some synergy here if we want to actually, do something similar here, change some questions so it's more appropriate for our much smaller jurisdiction. And again, I was blown away by how much they were committed to positive family youth engagement and probation. So there really was no like attempt to get buy-in and hitting hurdles and obstacles. Instead, it's just two groups of people who are very committed and we're looking for a partnership.
Well, Adam, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for sharing this amazing work with us. I think it's a somewhat novel topic that deserves further consideration, particularly given its implications for youth involved in the justice system. But before I get to the closing announcements, do you have any parting words of wisdom for us?
Absolutely. I'll keep it brief because I know we're under a minute left, but I want to bring back something I said earlier. We're getting better at incorporating this risk, need, responsivity framework. We're getting better at saying we need to assess youth and families' risks, their needs, and their responsivity to what it is we're trying to do together. But for some reason, family youth engagement still isn't a part of that process, right? Your perceptions of, expectations for your relationship with your POs. And I think that's a mistake. I think we need to start assessing it and we need to start building that family youth engagement from day one or even day zero before you step foot right in that room. I don't think the process is actually that clearly explained to youth and families. And I know that because research shows that families actually tend to fail legal knowledge tests, right? That's what our research shows. And I think that family engagement needs to be a part of the process from day one. We need to assess it because I think it's going to impact how responsive youth and families actually are to what it is you're trying to do together. So thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, Giza. Thank you, Youth Justice Institute, and thanks everyone for joining today and spending your lunch or breakfast hour with us.
Thank you, Adam. But before we close, I do have just a few announcements and items to put on everybody's radar. The next session of our Lunch and Learn series will be on June 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be hosting Dr. Janet Lauritsen, Curator's Distinguished Professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri St. Louis. She will be presenting her recent research on the violent victimization of lesbian, gay, and bisexual emerging adults. So be on the lookout for registration information for that great webinar that's coming up. The YJI also has an ongoing podcast series called Let's Talk About Youth Justice. The inaugural episode features a conversation with Dr. Timothy McCuddy, who spoke with me about traditional bullying, cyberbullying, and issues related to both. And I believe Alicia will be putting the link for that podcast episode in the chat section. We've also been in the process of producing new episodes for this series this semester, so be on the lookout for new content from us. We also invite you to join us from Tuesday, June 1st through Thursday, June 3rd for Beyond 2020, The Next Normal, COVID-19 and Youth. This series of web-based panel discussions asks youth justice stakeholders from around the country to explore the pandemic's continued impacts on youth, their families, and their communities, as well as concrete actions that will move us closer to eliminating racial and ethnic disparities, ensuring equity and justice, and prioritizing individual and communal health and well-being. For more information and to register, we ask that you go to the link that is being provided in the chat, and we look forward to seeing you there. Shortly after we finish here, we will be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete the survey, as it allows us to gain your feedback and improve webinar sessions for the future. This survey should take no longer than 5 minutes, and we will also be putting the link for that in the chat. And finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. And in closing, I just want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn webinar series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you continue to think about the work that Dr. Fine has presented here today. We also look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.